All right, so in this lecture, I'm going to discuss what culture is. I've certainly used that word a few times already, and you would think, since it's mostly what anthropologists talk about, we would have a pretty good definition. But our definition is actually very complicated, and it takes a whole slideshow to really explain. So in your textbook, you will soon read about this bee larva onion soup story. And I'm not going to explain too much about it. You should read it for yourself. But the idea is that culture not only determines what you know, but it determines how you view the world. That story is about Kulturbrille, culture glasses, that it's your view on the world. So check out that story when you get to that part of the textbook and come back to the slide maybe and think about how that is Kulturbrille, a concept we've already talked about. So Tyler defines culture as knowledge, belief, arts, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. Right? So basically what Tyler did in 1871 was he just listed off a lot of things that people do. They have knowledge, they have beliefs, they make art, they have morals, they create laws, they have customs, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man. It was 1870. He means people. You should use the term people instead of man as a member of society. So it's a two-part definition in which Tyler lists out all the things that people do. Of course, he leaves out language, music, science, religion, and a couple other things that were really important. But that second part is that you have to learn it from somebody else. So culture has to be shared with other people. So it's all the things we do, but you have to have learned it from another person or another group of people. Clifford Geertz defined culture as a historically transmitted pattern of meanings embodied in symbols, a system of inherited conceptions expressed in symbolic forms by means of which men, again people, can communicate, perpetuate, and develop their knowledge about and attitudes toward life. This one's really complicated. Geertz puts in the idea of symbols being really important to culture, and they certainly are. He also brings in the idea of this system. These cultural traits are inherited. Again, you learn it from someone else. And it's the way in which we communicate, so language. Perpetuate, it's the things we teach. And develop, it's the research we do. Right? So though this is a very wordy explanation, largely it's very similar to that of Tyler, except he adds that it has to be learned from other people. Boyd and Richardson, who were not both anthropologists, define culture as the transmission from one generation to the next via teaching and imitation of knowledge, values, and other factors. So they agree that you have to learn culture from other people, and they, in their definition, really emphasize teaching and how people learn things. The point is that a lot of anthropologists have tried to define culture, and even non-anthropologists, a lot of social scientists have tried to define culture. Personally, I like to just say culture is what people do. All right, that doesn't mean that animals can't do it. It's just culture is most of the things that we do. That, in fact, some things may be biological, but most things have a combination in that it's both biological and the concerns and norms around them are culturally based. So I'm not sure that's the best definition, but culture is what people do. You may have heard of a nature versus nurture debate in social science, or maybe just on the news. This debate is still ongoing in science and probably will never be solved, but anthropologists would argue that the majority of nurture is cultural. Effectively, nature are the things that you're biologically programmed to do, and culture are the things that you learn to do via nurture, right? What you learn to do, think about, and say are subtly or bluntly influenced by the cultures in which you exist, the people you have met, and the things they have taught you. Anthropologists divide culture into 5 different aspects. They argue that culture is learned, shared, based on symbols, integrated, and dynamic. So culture is nurture. It's learned from other people. It's not coded in your genes. If you took a culture away from a child away from their biological parents, she or he would swiftly learn the culture of the people who she or he was with, or them. The process through which people learn culture is called enculturation. Boyd and Richardson argue that you can model this under their dual inheritance theory, the idea that you get a biological inheritance and a cultural inheritance. So culture are the things you learn, biology is coded in your actual biological genes. So you have to learn your culture from someone else. If a child was raised in isolation, they would not have culture because they would not learn it from other people. Culture is also shared. You can't have a culture of just one person. There are many levels on which you can share culture. The smallest level is a group of friends, and the largest would be a worldwide club or nation, perhaps the concept of Western culture, Europe, US, Canada, countries like that all share common cultural identity. You could have a very silly culture of just three people, which is my Halo example. You can have three guys who used to sit on a couch in the early 2000s playing a video game called Halo, who had developed a group of code words for the various silly weapons of that game. And that thing, as silly as it is, saying, oh, I'm going to go after this weapon and calling it whatever, having shared language means that those three individuals shared a culture. So you can have a culture of 2 people, and you can have a culture of 2 billion people, right? So cultures really vary in scale, and who you choose or don't choose to share your culture with is usually the beginning of cultures, subcultures, nations, ethnicity, so on and so forth. That in fact, how you share your culture and when you choose to share your culture or not share your culture is the formation or forms the boundaries and walls between the various cultures in which we exist. So the sharing or not sharing of cultures leads to subcultures, ethnic groups, nations, so on and so forth. Anthropologists define ethnic groups as people who identify themselves as a distinct group based on shared ancestry or various cultural features. The term ethnicity refers to customs or expression of cultural traits held by an ethnic group. It comes from the Greek word ethnikos and ethnos, custom, and nation. Often ethnicity and race become conflated. We'll talk about that a bit later, but keep in mind that anthropologists refer to ethnicity as being a cultural trait. The terms subculture and culture are somewhat interchangeable. Typically, cultures are larger, right, such as the culture of the United States or Japan or the culture of Wisconsin. Often, culture refers to a group that is locationally based, meaning they have a geographic space, but that's not always the case. You can have internet culture that is big or something like that. Subculture is a culture within a culture. It usually refers to smaller groups, such as the subculture of people who watch Star Trek, or people who love to watch baseball, or people who love the Packers, right? So often when you use this term subculture, you are recognizing that they are a portion of a larger group, a larger culture, right? So you could argue that there's a subculture of baseball fans amongst the people who live in North America, right? Or a subculture of people who watch Star Trek amongst the people of North America, right? So you're referencing the fact when you use the term subculture that they are a portion of a larger group, right? Now, you could say, you know, this is a culture or this is a subculture, and I probably won't correct you that it is very subjective, right? But keep in mind that typically subcultures are smaller, and you use the term subculture when you're recognizing that they are a subpart, a smaller part of a larger culture. So again, the line between subcultures and cultures is somewhat fuzzy, to say the least. And if you called something a subculture that somebody else thought was a culture, or vice versa, very few people are going to call you out. Overall, anthropologists look at both cultures and subcultures. And there are a lot of examples of subcultures in our society in the United States. You can talk about the subculture of sports fan, the subculture of punks, the subculture of you could do it by gender. You say there's a subculture of women who do whatever, or things like that, right? So anytime you're saying there's a division within a larger culture, that's probably a subculture. But again, the two can largely be used interchangeably. Ethnic groups are the largest of cultures in most cases. The term ethnic is often confused and used alongside the word race. We'll get a chance to talk about that later. The two are certainly intertwined, but not necessarily the same. Ethnic groups are large macrocultures which often correlate to a region of the world or a certain race. So these are people who have a common ancestry, or large groups of people who think that they share a common national identity. So though this won't be graded, it's a good idea for you to kind of think about the cultures and subcultures that you yourself are within. So what I want you to do is draw a central circle and write yourself, your name, and then draw the various circles that you're in, somewhat like a Venn diagram. So for instance, you might say, you know, I am a professor, and so I put a large circle that touches my internal myself circle that says university culture, and then I'm also an academic, and then I'm also in the archaeological culture, and in the anthropological culture, and things like that. So kind of think about all the different cultures that you're in and which ones overlap and which ones don't, right? And kind of in the end make this Venn diagram. And in doing so, you'll realize that, you know, I'm in the larger Western world culture, I'm in the United States culture, I may have been influenced by other countries, I may be a nerd, I may be a sports fan, I may be all these different things, and you realize that some of those overlap and some of those don't. So if you've got a spare 10 minutes, again, I won't grade those, it might be a fruitful exercise for you to kind of draw those various cultures you're in kind of a Venn diagram sort of way. So knowing what we now know about cultures, that there's a lot of aspects to cultures, how you define them, how you divide them up, that they're, you know, learned, shared, dynamic, integrated, things like that. What again is cultural relativism? Cultural relativism is when you don't judge cultures based on the standards of your own. And I've purposely offered you a couple different definitions of this. And ultimately, that's the goal of the class, is to get you to recognize all the aspects of culture and realize that everybody does the things they do, the social norms and things like that, for a reason, right? So the authors of your textbook are going to lay out several arguments for cultural relativism. So be sure to pay attention to those as you read through the textbook and kind of keep those on the forefront of your mind as we move through the class.